We'll open up with Shanker now. Thanks.
Thank you, Rowan. What I'd like to do, this is obviously a very difficult subject. While the opportunities are immense in terms of services access for Australian companies into Asia, the challenges are, some would say, equally immense. We have made available, I think, for everybody here, an op-ed that I did in the Financial Times recently that accompanied the launch of a study that we did for the Council on Foreign Relations. And the study that we did dealt with the major issue in services negotiations now. And that major issue is what we have called anti-competitive market distortions. And these are the regulatory barriers, the behind-the-border distortions. You know, we think of trade negotiations in a goods context with respect to tariff reductions. And we've been very successful, we globally have been very successful in lowering the overall tariff burden in the goods sector. But we have not been very successful in dealing with behind-the-border barriers and regulatory distortions. And to give you a sense of the scale of the problem, in the US alone, and the US is a relatively free, competitive market economy, regulatory distortions probably account for anywhere between 1.5 and $2 trillion of the US economy, probably about 12 to 15% of the US economy. So if you consider China, Russia, India, countries that are not as competitive markets inside the border, you consider the effect of this on the global economy, it's very significant. And if we can succeed in lowering some of these regulatory distortions and regulatory barriers, that will be an injection into the global economy that will be much needed and will obviously solve a lot of problems. So essentially what has happened in trade negotiations is, as I said, we've negotiated goods agreements, tariffs have come down. As tariffs come down, the inside the border measures, these barriers, become much more pernicious and much more effective in stalling international trade, particularly international trade and services. What are these regulatory distortions, these what we've characterized as anti-competitive market distortions? It essentially is anything that the government does or that private sector, you know, in tandem with the government does, to distort the market in ways that damage economic welfare. So what are we looking for in trade? You know, why do we do trade? We do trade in order to improve import competition so that welfare gains will cause the market to grow, lift the poor out of poverty, and so forth. We don't do trade, and sometimes we lose sight of this, we don't do trade negotiations so that our companies can do better than their companies. That's very much the way trade negotiators sometimes see things, but that's not the fundamental purpose of trade liberalization. The fundamental purpose of trade liberalization is to ensure that the market grows and it's a non-zero sum game where everybody wins. These regulatory distortions, these anti-competitive market distortions, damage the ability to deliver competition on the merits as the organizing economic principle. And so you say, what are these sorts of things? Anti-competitive distortions sort of fall into a number of categories that we've outlined in our paper for the Council on Foreign Relations. One is regulations, government regulations that limit the number and range of competitors. So, for example, in India, the retail services ban, which hopefully will be lifted, but you know, it's taking some time. Airline agreements where you have provisions that damage the ability of foreign airlines to access markets. There are some very good examples of these types of distortions in the telecommunications sector. If you look at, for example, a case that we were involved in the mid-90s involving Telmex in Mexico, what you had there is you had a move from a public monopoly with regulation to a private monopoly without regulation. And what Telmex was able to do in the regulatory context that it found itself in was to distort the market, to anti-competitively cross-subsidize and to knock out competitors who had been granted access under the various agreements that the US and Mexico had, and the WTO Basic Telecoms Agreement and the reference paper. There are regulations that restrict the ability of companies to compete. This is perhaps one of the most important areas. We had a panel earlier on today about innovation. And innovation clearly is a huge productive efficiency gain. It injects huge amounts of wealth into the economies. We've seen this in the last 50, 60 years. But innovation can be stalled by these types of issues, where you disrupt the ordinary competitive process. What we're seeing in a number of markets, China, Russia, India, and others, is an attempt to use, for example, standards to skew the market in favor of particular companies. One of the reasons that type of thing is so difficult to attack is because it doesn't fit into the traditional trade paradigm. The traditional trade paradigm is it discriminatory? Is the measure, does it discriminate against foreign suppliers? And many of these types of distortions, they certainly do damage foreign suppliers, but they also damage local suppliers. And they damage the market, they damage local consumers who have to pay higher prices and have less choice. But it doesn't fall into the traditional trade paradigm, and so we have great difficulty in solving these problems. Our subsidies agreements don't really get at them. The number of cases the WTO has filed, has ruled on, including things like the Canada Wheat Board case and other cases like that, have not really dealt with these types of problems. I'll give you, one example of how this works. As an example that we use in our paper, if you look at the iPhone market in China, what China has done is has embraced a standard in telecommunications, the TD-SCDMA standard, which only certain, it's a standard that very much favors China Mobile. It's a wireless standard that favors China Mobile. It makes it very difficult for competitors to have access to that market. It doesn't mean they're foreclosed from the market. Apple, they can go in and they can sell their phones, they can sell their products. It's just that their costs have been artificially raised and the competitors' costs have been artificially lowered. And that is the most pernicious aspect of these types of distortions. They don't close the market off completely. But they do make it very difficult for somebody who's been given market access to have market contestability, to be able to be a viable competitor in those markets. And then the third major category would be the whole area of state-owned enterprises. Again, something that afflicts the Asian region particularly. And again, this is not just China. China tends to be held up as an example of this, but there are many state-owned enterprises all over the world. And again, there's nothing wrong with a state-owned enterprise. The problem occurs where the government is using privileges, rights, licensing, all kinds of other factors to give that state-owned company an edge in global competition over its private competitors. Why is that bad? It's bad because it distorts the process of competition. It shrinks the market for that service. And remember, this is a non-zero-sum game. So it shrinks the market. Consumers have to pay higher prices, and it damages the economy of the country that does it, but it also damages the global economy and the economy of the countries that are the export providers. What should we do about this? Very, very quickly. We've advocated actually looking at these regulatory barriers, and we've advocated a plurilateral agreement amongst countries that are actually believe in competition on the merits as an organizing economic principle. And this is something where, Australia has a great comparative advantage. I mean, some of the things that Australia has done domestically through the ACCC and the way to regulate in a pro-competitive fashion is really ahead of the game. The OECD regulatory toolkit and competition assessment are in many ways modeled on Australia's system and the UK system as well. But the notion of the benefits that you can gain from pro-competitive regulation is understood here. And therefore, we've advocated a plurilateral agreement amongst a set of countries where we can make progress in this area. Unfortunately, Rowan mentioned the TPP, I mentioned the Doha round. We have our various negotiations in the world, Doha, TPP, all of our bilateral FTAs in the US, have tried to touch on this area, and it is very, very difficult. It's proven very, very difficult to do it because many of our agreements are with countries that, frankly, want to distort their market because they have an industrial policy that favors national champions. And this, again, is not limited to the large BRIC Asian giants. It's true in many countries in the world, and in certain sectors it's true in the US and in Europe as well. So we need this type of discipline not only to ensure that the marketplace is not being skewed in favor of national champions, but we in the US and in Europe need it in order to discipline ourselves and to prevent our own regulatory distortions, which have increased over the last 5 or 6 years very significantly. We believe that China and India will support such an initiative because Chinese companies are adversely affected by these distortions in other markets. They're adversely affected in Asia, they're adversely affected in Europe and the US. And there are all kinds of investment restrictions here, Canada, the US, that adversely affect Chinese companies as well. So we think there's actually going to be some support even amongst the BRIC countries for that type of approach. We've also talked about defensive measures with respect to anti-competitive distortions. If a government is distorting the market deliberately to secure an advantage for one of its firms, doing it in ways that if it did it through a tariff or it did it through a more direct subsidy would be illegal under WTO law. We believe you have to have some type of a stick. There has to be some type of defensive measure, and the US has a number of laws that we can use to discipline such behavior and ensure that the goal of competitive markets around the world can actually be achieved. And the final point I would say is there is a role for competition agencies around the world who have traditionally not been involved, particularly in the trade process. There is a role for competition agencies to be much more involved in not only framing pro-competitive regulation at home, but in ensuring pro-competitive regulations around the world through better integrating them into dialogues with trade agencies in other countries. So I'll stop there. I'm sure we'll have time in the